Well, I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Chairman. Members, my name is James Quintero. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I want to thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts on property taxes today. But before I get going, I want to also thank Vice Chairman Springer for his incredible effort on this committee. I think we've done a world of good, and your services will be missed, sir.
Thank you, James.
I want to begin by actually appreciating the nature of the charge itself, because of course we are looking at additional property tax relief and reform, and as the name implies, we have actually done, I think, a lot of really good work on tax reform and tax relief. And I need not remind this body, but for those watching, in 2019 we instituted a slew of very good reforms involving compression and the institution of a revenue limit. We also in 2021 did some really good work on the homestead exemption, and then of course we had historic property tax relief last session. So I look forward to the work ahead, but of course the charge itself is forward oriented, and so what I want to do is encourage the body to do two things in particular. One is go big, and the second is to guard the gains. And what I mean on the go big is
go big is that's the finance committee side. We've already taken that testimony.
That's right. That's right.
You can talk about guard the gains.
Guard the gains. So in preparation for this testimony, what I had an opportunity to do is jot down 35 separate reforms, which you will find in the back section of that paper. And what I attempted to do is organize them according to the ones that would affect M&O, the ones that would affect INS, and I have kind of about 5 of them which I couldn't fit in either bucket, but I think would really improve the property tax system. So real quick, of course we don't have time to go through all 35, but and I'm happy to answer any questions about them, but really quick, what I'd like to do is just touch on 1 or 2 for each category, and then we can go from there. For the M&O, what I think would most help looking forward is to re-examine the voter approval tax rate and bring some uniformity to the system so that some jurisdictions are not operating under the old system and some jurisdictions are not operating at that 2.5% level. Of course, we know that we have a 2.5%, a 3.5%, and an 8% in effect. I think all political subdivisions ought to be operating on one standard, preferably set at a little bit lower of a threshold since we're looking at it anyways. And that will, I hope, not only help protect against excessive tax increases, but encourage voter participation.
That was the original version of SB2 of 2019, if you remember.
So, and again, there's lots of other M&O related changes I think we could make, but looking at that voter approval tax rate and strengthening that will help with any future tax relief and keeping it intact. On the INS side, what I would encourage the body to do is to look at the process by which bonds are formulated, promoted, and awarded. And what I mean is that when you look at the local government debt environment, it's very clear to me that school districts in particular are taking on massive amounts of new debt. And it's been my experience that you have a small cadre of special interests, and I'm talking about the architects, the engineers, the construction firms, and the bond lawyers, who have really turned this into a cottage industry and have begun or have continued to benefit from the passage of bonds. And if I had a magic wand, one small change that I would make is to disallow anyone who makes a contribution to a PAC to then be awarded a contract from a bond that is passed. Right? I think we have to begin to put in place some sort of preventative measures to begin breaking up that particular industry. And then lastly, in terms of the other reforms, the ones that are in green on the very back, this year I will start on the dissertation component of my education. And I've actually selected to study Senate Bill 2, and its impact on the average homeowner. Thus far, I've been able to shepherd this concept through my
2023 or 2019?
2019.
Okay.
And so when you look at the literature, what's become clear to me is that there's lots of TEL research out there, but what usually happens is the academic will look at a TEL from the government standpoint. They'll say, well, this TEL was instituted on this government and its revenues were affected or its expenditures were affected or whatnot. Okay, I want to come at it from the opposite perspective, and I want to know, how did a TEL benefit the average person in an affected jurisdiction? And I've selected Senate Bill 2 to study, and what I want to know based on a sample is, when this new law took effect, did the average homeowner experience any material benefit in terms of maybe there were some reduced foreclosure rates, maybe there was increased investment on that property, et cetera? Anyways, all of these things, as I've gotten into the literature, it's very clear to me that state-imposed property tax revenue limits do have something of an unintended consequence because jurisdictions don't like to adjust their expenditures. And so they go out there, they become subject to a revenue limit, and what ends up happening is you see an increase in fees, other tax sources go up, et cetera, et cetera. So when considering how to best protect all of these gains, I think it's very clear to me that we need a local expenditure limit of a similar nature to the one that is imposed upon the state. And of course, the state is subject to 5 constitutional and statutory spending limits. I would select just one. Let's go back to that 2021 version that the legislature imposed upon itself and extend that down to political subdivisions. And there, when you control the level of expenditure growth, that will necessarily translate into a reduction in your tax burden.
So, James, that's a concept. You want to go back to the original version of Tabor in Colorado, which was a uniform expenditure, tax and expenditure limitation, TEL, because that was what it became corrupted by, I don't know, 300. I'm not even sure how many amendments. But that's what your theory is at this point.
Correct. I think that original version of Tabor is the gold standard of tax and expenditure limits, and we ought to strongly consider implementing one here in Texas.
Now, if you ask your person right to your left, he has the data on SB2, because I believe you've done those calculations, or Dale did, right? So at least you get part of your thesis done by asking the question, but source the data, of course.
And, Mr. Chairman, if I could offer one more quick comment to Senator Eckhart's comments on the special districts, I think we're right on. Looking at the data, it's very clear that we have lots of special purpose district growth. In fact, the latest data shows that of the 4,532 jurisdictions that were in existence in 2022, roughly half of those were special. What I have long advised the body to consider is divide those into 2 categories. One obviously provides infrastructure, and I think those are of a special nature. The others provide services. We ought to put those that provide services under some sort of sunset review, where the legislature is tasking an agency to go through these different entities to review. Has your original purpose been fulfilled? Is there any sort of mission creep? Is there a need for your continued existence, et cetera? Right? There ought to be some logical process by which we review those entities, or I would also encourage the implementation of some sort of sunset mechanism where these entities are coming up on, let's say, a 10-year basis for reauthorization at a public election. So those would be my 2 pieces of advice.
Something we agree on.
Yes, ma'am.
You know, James, I could keep you up here for a very long time.
Oh, it's
all right. No, and but go ahead.
One quick one, sure. Mr. Chairman. James, again, appreciate the kind words. Next to the last page, you had number 10 on there. Talks about INS going from maybe 50 cents to 40 cents. Yeah, one of my big challenges in 12 years is trying to figure out sometimes how we need to use a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. Because I think there's times you could say they should be at 20, but I can give you some examples where, you know, I had a school district that just needed to rebuild they have it's a 1-building schoolhouse, K through 8. They had to rebuild it. They went from 0 INS to 49 cents to build an $8 million building. I mean,
yeah.
You know, and so we look at those. I can go to Lido and Prosper, which are just rooftops. They don't have any commercial. But, we can go to, Gainesville or Denton, where I'll pick Denton in my own district. Lots of commercial activities. They have a much lower INS than some of those. And so I think you probably need to refine that and look at it as a percentage of commercial versus rooftops or something like that, to be able to factor in there that the unintended consequences of trying to make sure that that's not being bloated. We don't hurt some people who really need it.
I think that's fair point, sir. Yeah.
Thank you.
And James, I think we can get the bond board to tell us what happened with the bond issues. I believe they keep track of that, right?
And so, to my knowledge,
The largest bond in history failed by their secret code was 41. Okay. Well below 50.
duly noted.
Right, so, and then on the VATREs, I think the education TA would keep that, because they would have to, well, maybe not if the result isn't to ratify. It's to, we might need to talk about data collection on those VATRs. I'm not sure if we haven't, I'm not sure Comptroll, no, they wouldn't be doing. I don't think anybody's tracking this, come to think of it.
And I'm ashamed to admit that I only tracked 43, Senator. You mentioned 62, so I have some homework to do when I get home.
I just got a statistic. So I think out of, I wrote it down here. I think it was out of 53 TREs by school districts, 31 of them failed. So one of your recommendations is to make it a 60% majority to pass. I think we're already seeing that voters are perfectly fine.
Well, I did an
responding.
interview for Dallas Morning News, and I used the term, I thought it was the failure rate was about 60%.
So I think we're good. I think that the voters are speaking just fine.
Now, if I understand the statute correctly, and that's not to say I do, but if I do, there is nothing to prohibit those districts from coming back at taxpayers in the next November, attempting again to ask them for another excessive tax increase. And so,
You think taxpayers are stupid?
I think that governmental entities have a tendency to pester voters until they get what they want.
You actually think voters who are pestered are more likely to pass a TRE?
There is nothing to prevent a governmental entity from continuing to ask. It's almost like a small child asking an adult to get them something until that adult finally breaks.
I'd like to ask you some other things.
Yes, ma'am.
What does the state use for its own expenditure cap?
So it depends on which one that you consider. The two that I would say most frequently we interact with, there's a constitutional governing mechanism on the rate of appropriations growth not dedicated by the Constitution. And then the one in the 2021 legislative session that was passed ties general revenue related monies to the rate of population and inflation. And that would actually be my preferred mechanism. Yeah.
So population plus inflation. And yet we have limited some to 3.5%. So why not just give counties population plus inflation?
I think
Counties and cities.
They do get population growth because you get new stuff added to the rolls. Doesn't count, so it can go well and above 3.5.
Right.
Yeah.
That's true.
so. I think if it
New
was
construction plus 3.5%.
yeah. So there are some
So,
exceptions.
but James will take inflation and population. And I actually passed that 20 years ago, and it's still in court. I believe it's finally going to be adjudicated by Bruce Hotze. Actually got a trial date.
I'm just intrigued. I haven't gone over all of these, and I'm looking forward to going over
Yes, ma'am.
all of them. Very interesting to me. But I am intrigued. One of your recommendations is to apply a standardized and simplified 3.5% to all of the taxing entities. As I recall, y'all won the support of smaller governmental entities for the 3.5% by promising you wouldn't put it on them. But now you're recommending that it should go on everybody, right?
Well, the position that I occupy at the foundation allows me to assume a purist ideological position.
You are so
So-
lucky. You get to be a purist.
My friends at the legislature, have to deal with the details. I get to articulate the ideal, and in the ideal, I think we ought to have one low standard that applies uniformly to everyone.
Well, I've often said that the perfect should not be the enemy of the good.
Yes,
So let me ask you another one of your recommendations. And again, I want to drill down on these a little harder, but you have a recommendation number 6 to amend the statutory definition of debt because these crazy bond lawyers are out there like running bonds and warrants and certificates of obligation, and it's those crazy bond lawyers.
I didn't know you were one.
I'm not a bond lawyer. But of course, the state doesn't build schools or courthouses. The state doesn't build county jails. How do you propose these local entities build such things as schools, courthouses, and county jails, except for debt? I mean, would you prefer them to pay for them as they go, in which case that's going to be a very heavy burden on the current taxpayer?
Well, and I think you raise a fine point. And I do want to say that the foundation does not oppose debt in all instances, and I think it does make sense in the right circumstance to utilize borrowing of some fashion. That said, when you look at the rate of consumption of public debt among school districts in particular, you see that it's very excessive. We have lots of data on that, and I'm happy to provide that to you. One thing to kind of maybe help get at your point, though, about what do we do, I have long looked at the state of Florida and the design that they have for school districts to build school buildings. And what the state of Florida does, my understanding is that they've really centralized the design process at the state level so as to effectively excise or at least mitigate the cost of that is attributed to your architects and your engineers. And so school districts, when they want to build a school building, effectively use a template of sorts that's already been provided.
Model design.
Model
I
design.
talked to Speaker Dan
Yes.
about this, but at ALEC conference.
And it's a very good model that I hope the legislature will use to help control the rate of borrowing by school districts. That's just one way.
I think that these are very good suggestions, both for schools and for county jails, because in both instances, you can look at tilt wall construction and various other things. You could even look at 3D printing in some regards. So I think with regard to those sorts of vertical development, I would love to work with you on that.
Yes, ma'am.
But I want to caution this committee that there are many things that cities, counties, school districts, hospital districts, and various other clear governmental entities are paying for out of these bonds. For instance, IT infrastructure. I will speak from what I know. I was never on the school board, although my kids did go through a public school. But speaking from what I know, just in regard to courts, for instance, the state pays less than, I'm going to say mas o menos, I'm going to inflate it. It's less than 20 cents on the dollar for what counties pay for courthouse infrastructure. And the state pays nothing for bricks and mortar infrastructure, nothing for IT infrastructure, except for some Office of Governor grants that are passed through usually of federal dollars and OCA grants. So these bond dollars are absolutely crucial to effective and efficient local government. And you will see higher tax burdens if you don't allow local governments to appropriately borrow when the interest rates are low and the price point, and they're doing it early. If you hamper them from appropriate debt financing, you will end up costing the taxpayer more because your government will be ineffective and inefficient and not be able to handle the population growth.
And your point's well taken on the county jails. I don't have much of a rebuttal, but when it comes to school districts, who again are the leading consumer of public debt in Texas, it does strike me that school districts seem to be shifting a lot of things that used to be paid for with their operating budgets, with their M&O rate, onto the INS side. And I've actually highlighted one of those instances related to Round Rock ISD's $998 million bond, most of which was just approved last week. And in the recent community impact article, we have the superintendent actually saying that if we have a leaky roof at McNeil High School, or if we have a chiller at one of our campuses that breaks down and we have to replace it, we have to tap into our maintenance and operations budget. Well, that's what a maintenance and operations budget is for. It's for maintenance. And so those things shouldn't be pushed off onto debt, because that is further exacerbating school district spending and borrowing.
All right, James, we're going to have a discussion about
Yes,
this.
ma'am.
Okay,
Because-
but-
and we'll have it at a different day and a
Right,
different
please.
time.
All right. That's right.
Because
Yes, ma'am.
there are very serious discussions that we need to have with regard to what you do when you have a budget and you have some inputs, some costs that are absolutely predictable. They are not one-time costs. They are ongoing, and they are absolutely predictable. And what is appropriate for debt financing and what isn't. Because I think that you are making leaps that if you sit down with budget officers, you will have a better understanding of how they are actually saving money by debt financing and how important of a mechanism that is for them. So I'd love to talk to you about it at another time.
Bob, you went in on this? No. Yeah, all right, okay. Anyway, James, look, I really appreciate all this. We're going to upgrade the number of taxing units to 4,500 and how many?
Let's see. Now, this was 2022 data. I hadn't had a chance to go through
I
the
can make a
controls.
quick calculation from there, but that will mean we're approaching roughly 4,800.
And to my knowledge, we actually have the second greatest number of political subdivisions in the U.S. behind only Illinois. At last I checked. So
Well, and the good news is that we used to chase Illinois on tax rate, and we were right behind them as the third highest tax rate in the country. And we have fortunately turned away from that path, and we're apparently have fallen to 10th place.
Okay.
That's the latest number I'm getting, but so we have stopped chasing Illinois, and for one, I'm very happy about that. I never really liked Illinois anyway. I don't know why they're so popular, but whatever.